All right. Just a quick intro. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I'm Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm convener of Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University. I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Andrew Thomas, who is a lecturer at Deakin University on Middle East and International Relations, a good colleague. We had a great conversation a couple of days ago, did a joint podcast looking at Iran, proxy wars. So it's quite opportune that his book has just come out on that very topic. And the book is available. Andrew has worked on Middle East issues, Middle East politics for many, many years. The book is the result of many years of research and thinking on this very important topic. And he is bringing in a new perspective on how we understand foreign policy making, because so often foreign policy making is looked from the perspective of Western scholarship. So Andrew is really tearing the table and looking at a different perspective. And Iran is a big player in the region. As you will all know, you follow the news, big issue, big problem, if you like. So it'd be really good to hear Andrew's thinking on how we should understand Iran's foreign policy thinking and its agenda. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Andrew to the podium.
Thank you so much, Shahram. And thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for taking the time out of your Friday. So yeah, as Shahram said, it's been a very long road. I calculate about 10 years to get this book out. So a better part of a decade, if we include my PhD, which of course we do. But here we are, finally. So thank you so much to Shahram and Messef for having me here and helping me put this on. It's great to see so many colleagues, friends and family here as well. Which you've all heard me drone on about Iranian foreign policy in one way or another. At least now you get to do it with free coffee and lunch. So count yourselves lucky. So I promise I won't go on for too long. And we're looking at about half an hour to get through this, and then we can have some questions. Also thank you to the people who couldn't be here, of which there are many. A lot of people in my life have made this happen. So it wasn't just me. I put the blood, sweat and tears in, I guess, but there were a lot of supportive people around that helped me do it. So without further ado, like any good academic making a speech, I'm going to go back about several hundred years, long before the focus of this book, and swear its relevancy to what I'm talking about. So I start the book by saying that explorations or academic explorations in any field are often haunted by the origins of the field itself. And for those of you who have never studied international politics, I know a lot of you have, or foreign policy before, you inevitably start your degree with this picture. So this is the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the accord that ended both the 30 years and 80 years wars in Europe. At some point in your undergraduate studies, you learn that this is widely considered the beginning of international relations as a practice, creating the nation state, sovereign independence, and diplomatic principles. In the 17th century, international relations and European relations were the same thing. International politics was European politics. There wasn't anything beyond that. But as your undergraduate studies go on, and you learn more about international relations theory, security studies, diplomacy, and the like, you also start to discover that surprisingly little has changed, at least in the mainstream. While the subjects of the field have obviously gone beyond Europe, we still draw on the same basic assumptions that we did at this time. Explanatory approaches like liberalism and realism bring these assumptions with them into the 21st century and the era of globalization, where international relations should be, at least, truly international. So, since my undergraduate studies, I've often been frustrated with the way the field views the places beyond the West, particularly the Middle East and obviously by extension Iran. This isn't a problem in itself, and certainly not a unique problem in this field of study. But by continually using the same frames of reference and validating the same ideas, mainstream international relations analysis often removes important context and analysis from its subjects. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about IR theory here because it is a bit of a focus of the book, but I'll try and keep it simple and concise. For example, realist analysis, which is by far the dominant approach in security studies, tells us it is only survival in the condition of anarchy that motivates states, and that other factors are largely irrelevant. So states, for example, have the same relative character and survival instincts, no matter who they are, where they come from, what their population is. No cultural influence or very little cultural influence on decision making. It extricates history from analysis, saying that all that matters is survival in the moment. And cleaving, and basically cleaves totally the domestic and the international, which, as we know today, is kind of redundant in a globalized world, but nevertheless. So it doesn't matter what system of government a state has, the nature of its domestic political forces, and especially not its conditions of identity, it will always act within the confines of a cost-benefit analysis relating to its own survival. Similarly, liberal internationalism attempts to distance itself from its European origins. It assumes the liberal status quo benefits all states and societies, and it assumes that all states view it that way. There's the age-old adage of West is best in terms of liberal cultural values. And norms propagate from the global north outward, meaning that the developed world, the European world, give the rest of the world their values. And those values are universal. The European origins of liberal human rights, democracy, and its specific forms of emancipatory politics are, again, not a problem unto themselves. It doesn't matter where these ideas come from. A lot of them are accepted. But liberal actors often forgo these principles in favor of preserving a liberal order and hegemony. Now, this is not to say that mainstream approaches to IR, such as these, are counterproductive to analysis. They've been instrumental in making our world and its politics make sense over the last century and have done an amazing job at that. But as IR has become more about contexts beyond Europe, beyond the West, we can see that this is a little bit of a problem. The more mainstream IR is canonized and is like empirical knowledge, like science, the more native and non-Western perspectives are pushed to the periphery. And that in itself, I think, as in academia, is a bit of a problem. So Arkea and Buzan explain it like this. IR is constructed cross-culturally, but in the mainstream, we usually discuss it as if it is not. We usually discuss it as if it is scientific. Now, of course, I'm far from the first to notice this. Amazing scholars like Robbie Shilliam, Eric Ringmar, Amitav Arkaya, Barry Buzan, Amy Yang, Arlene Tickner, Ollie Waver, LHM Ling, I can go on, all reckoned with this lack of consideration of native and non-Western scholarship in our field head on. Arkaya and Buzan have said that Western scholarship is too narrow in its sources and too dominant in its influence to be good for the health of the wider IR project to understand the social world in which we live. LHM Ling, one of my favorite books, it's called Westphalia World. It's called The Tao of World Politics. And she calls Western IR Westphalia World. And it discounts the knowledge of multiple worlds and its way of knowing, even as Westphalia World routinely benefits from the global South's production of knowledge. Eric Ringmar, by modeling itself on European examples, an independent country would at best become simply an inferior version of the real thing in the eyes of the West and European IR. And then finally, Robbie Shilliam cautions Western scholars to be careful not to assume that non-Western categorization and conceptualizations of modern subjecthood are unsophisticated or even misguided simply because they clash with the epistemological common sense of the Western academy. Now, that's a long way of saying just because non-Western politics and IR don't agree on all the same things and aren't accessible in the same way, that they're not valid, that they don't bring us important insights. Now, you might be thinking, and understandably so, What is this Australian academic with a Western IR education doing attempting to undertake explorations in non-Western IR? Well, non-Western perspectives aren't considered by the broader academy, often for very good reasons. Non-Western perspectives can be scattered, contradictory, or even inaccessible thanks to language barriers or other barriers. Because of this, what happens is that Western scholars shy away from considering native and non-Western perspectives. My view is we owe it to ourselves to attempt to draw out through thought in cultures beyond our own, when and where we can, in order to bring historical, cultural, and epistemic nuance to the field. Non-Western scholarship should be acknowledged and at the disposal of all scholars, not as a tool, but as a well of knowledge. Pretty simple in some ways. So this brings us to the Iranian focus of the book. Why Iran? So the realpolitik view, or the realist view of Iran in foreign policy terms is something that many of us are actually quite familiar with, even those who don't study international politics, whether it be on the floor of the US Congress, in newspaper op-eds, or in foreign policy itself. The first example I bring up in the book is from the Congressional Research Service reports on Iran. These papers are designed to educate and inform members of Congress about different contexts, conflicts, and actors. They're high quality and well-researched, though their purpose is sometimes not to give nuance to the discussion about their subjects, particularly when it comes to foreign adversaries of the United States in this context, in sort of a foreign policy context. In the 2014 CRS report entitled Iran, US Concerns and Policy Responses, Iran's foreign policy is described as a product of the ideology of Iran's Islamic Revolution, blended with long-standing national interests, exhibiting elements of pragmatism. Phrases like this are common in all adversarial foreign policy contexts, but for our purposes, raise a few concerns. Firstly, the statement defines Iranian foreign policy in terms of a point of deviation from a cooperative relationship with the West, the Islamic Revolution. This effectively ignores any and all context prior to the revolution, including the 1951 coup orchestrated by the UK and US, overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh. Secondly, the term national interest is used to describe Iran's motivations, a term that is used very commonly within the classical realist and neo-realist traditions and beyond, and almost universally applied as a moniker for this universal motivation of states based on survival and continuing their power. This is where we assume that motivations for the states are all the same and that our definition of survival is the same, which is key to Iran as well. Finally, the statement finishes by saying that Iran exhibits elements of pragmatic foreign policy, implying that Iranian foreign policy, for the most part, is unpragmatic, assuming or alluding to the fact that Iran's a little bit crazy, a little bit nuts. It also alludes to the idea that pragmatism is an analytical term, objectively defined by cooperating with the predefined rules and congruence with positive characteristics. These characteristics include accepting the current international order as just and not rejecting it. Well, it's a short statement and clearly does not encompass the entire policymaking of the United States towards Iran, and clearly for the consumption of politicians in an adversarial context, this perspective of Iran as a monolithic ideological and theocratic force is common in security and international relations discussions. So given that a lot of policy and academic writing is like this, I felt Iran was an ideal case study to attempt to draw out these non-Western approaches and sort of see if there's any insights or differences within. But there are other reasons as well. Iranian history holds many encounters with the West. The Iranian state, which many would call a revisionist state, meaning that it sort of doesn't like the way that things are at the moment, it doesn't like the status quo, has a very different relationship to the current world order than its Western counterparts. While Iran was never a formal colony of the West, its people have undoubtedly had a colonial experience with the West. So the constitutional crisis, for example, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company stash, the 1951 coup as well, all represent a kind of external imposition of values on the Iranian people and on the Iranian government. The Iranian state has effectively institutionalized a resistance against the West since the 1979 revolution. You'd all be familiar with the Friday prayers, the Death to America prayers. Those happen every Friday. It is institutionalized to resist Western interference, and particularly US interference. A key point is that there is a lot of international relations scholarship coming out of Iran or from Iranian expats in English that is of excellent quality. So Kamran Martin, Hamira Moshilzadeh, Farid Maghrebi, Ziba Mir Hosseini, Ali Ansari, the list goes on. There's heaps. Non-Western perspectives are being shouted, not just in Persian, but in English as well. So that, as people who can't speak Farsi or Persian, that gives us no excuse but to draw on those perspectives. But also, and finally, Iran is frequently the topic of mainstream international politics. It is today, for example. The last few days, a high up member of the IRGC was killed in a bombing in Syria by the Israeli government. So, given the clear existence of non-Western perspectives from and about Iran, the aim of the book is to draw out and critically explore those understandings about Iran's relationship with the Western world, illustrating their value to theory, policy analysis, and experts on Iranian politics. So I do this by asking a few questions. How do Iranian perspectives or important contemporary interactions with the West differ from the majority of Western accounts? Is there much of a difference? Does examination of the chosen snapshot cases, which I'm about to go through, alter how these events are perceived? As the author has no practical knowledge or language other than English, how accessible are non-Western perspectives to scholars with language limitations? Again, that's a key part of the project as well. Provides a framework for scholars to look beyond their kind of lived experience and draw on cultures and identities other than their own. Does this project present a potentially useful analytical model for other contexts? These are obviously quite open questions, and they are more about encouraging exploration than sort of concrete findings or definitive conclusions. But I think the book shows the value of consciously drawing on Iranian scholarship when conducting international relations analysis, especially where scholars or analysts have little connection to Iran beyond their specific studies. And that's counter to what some people actually think. The difference is you're drawing on native scholarship, not assuming what native scholarship is saying. For Iranian perspectives to be engaged in a manner that they truly deserve in IR, academics with Western backgrounds must be encouraged to conduct studies that advocate for these methods of analysis. Also, an entirely Iranian perspective, say for example from the Islamic Republic itself, is not necessarily more helpful than an entirely Western one. It's just another side. And looking at this relationship between the West and Iran, we also need to be cautious of those narratives that could be cynical, shall we say. There are quite a lot of common themes in Iranian analysis on foreign policy encounters with the West. And the one that I focus on the most, and part of the methods of the study, is identity. So I use, not to go too much into the methods of it, but I use a constructivist framework to sort of tease out these native perspectives. And identity is a big one. It's probably the biggest one. Persian nationalism and heritage, for example, Persian kings, the Shah al-Mehr, etc. And the framing of competing national identities in that context. Not just Persian ones, Kurdish ones as well, and different identities in terms of Shia Twelvism or Zoroastrianism, or Baha'i, for example. And also debates and critiques surrounding Shiism in politics. Now, the assumption is that even at the elite level, there's almost no discussion, or no discussion can be had about the role of religion in politics. That's actually not true. figures like Khomeini, obviously, Ali Shariati, Abdul Karim Saroush, Taqi Mizbayazi, all have had a role in molding these discussions. Then we've got post-colonialism and critique of power relations. Now, you might remember me saying that Iran has had a colonial experience of some kind. Well, this has been integrated into state policy as well. For example, from sanctions policy, the rhetoric of elites, even Khomeiniism itself as resistance to external threats, and the writing of Jalal al-Ahmad and this idea of Gabzadegi, which is basically, I'm probably not saying that right, but this idea that the Western influence is toxic, a poison on the Iranian people. And many still believe that to be true. And it was one of the biggest sort of secular elements of the Islamic Revolution, was this idea that the West should be shaken off. Resistance to a Western global order in a foreign policy context is often state-affirming and pro-authoritarian. And we often sometimes have a view of post-colonial scholarship of being emancipatory, meaning about individual freedoms. It's not always used that way, not by the Iranian state. It can be used for the opposite, to take rights away and to justify action. It does incorporate mainstream IR as well. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Mainstream IR can be very, very useful in some cases, in a lot of cases. And in this case, it is about power balancing as well. Norm entrepreneurship and antipreneurship. It's about creating what is normal. If you don't like what is normal in global politics, you change it. That's a big driver behind Iranian foreign policy, to try and undermine or build up new norms. And then the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a key institution in doing that, or the IRGC, as an arbiter of this resistance. And as we'll talk about probably in some of our questions maybe, there's been a big shift of power toward the IRGC in recent years. Statecraft, Shiism, Shia Islam and democracy and the relationship, civil liberties and emancipation, factional politics and political will between the clerics and the IRGC and political elements and reformists and all of that stuff, very important. And reconciliation with the West and civilizational dialogue. This is one of the cases that I look at. In fact, the first case, which we'll look at in a moment, about the relationship between the US and Iran in particular has always been adversarial, but it's actually gotten close to being reconciled. The pendulum of thawing, unthawing with the West, and of course the JCPOA, or what we know as the Iran nuclear deal, which is probably the closest that the Iran and the United States have gotten to a détente. So in light of these themes, the book explores 4 case studies in an attempt to draw out Iranian perspectives on the Islamic Republic's encounters with the West. Each forms a chapter of the book. And chapter 1 is about Khatami's efforts at reconciliation with the West and the resulting axis of evil metaphor. So you might remember in 2002, George W. Bush makes a speech saying that there's 3 members of the axis of evil and Iran is one of them. But the chapter shows that which covers much of the presidency of Mohammad Khatami and his attempt at détente with the West, talks about how the September 11 attacks consumed foreign policy analysis of the time. It didn't really show that there were actually quite a lot of overtures between the US and Iran at the time as well. There was actually an intelligence sharing agreement from Iran about how to best combat al-Qaeda. And this was part of the president at the time, Mohammad Khatami's effort to push Iran into a new policy direction, one of cultural egalitarianism through implementing a dialogue among civilizations. And in fact, the year 2000 was proclaimed by the UN as the year of the dialogue among civilizations. This was from a push from Mohammad Khatami. However, President George W. Bush's designation of Iran as part of an axis of evil largely put an end to those overtures. Basically pushed Iran away from this potential détente. Chapter 2, again, sort of challenges the idea that domestic politics and foreign policy are inherently mutually exclusive, not connected at all. It looks at the 2009 Iranian presidential elections and the discursive representation of Iran's political system in the West, particularly in Western media. So I do a media analysis in this one. One of the biggest critiques of IR is that it too often compartmentalizes domestic and foreign politics. The idea that international relations is inherently about external threats, ideas, and actors is counterproductive to exploring non-Western perspectives, primarily. This case has less to do with IR at the state level, but instead exposes the political impact of discourse and representations of identity more generally. Essentially, scholarly and media coverage of the internationally criticized Iranian election that saw President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad gain a second term manifests Western assertions of culture, otherness, modernity, and liberalism inside it. This has consequences for Iran's foreign policy relationship with the West, as it entrenches ideas of the unacceptable nature of otherness as it relates to democracy. To illustrate this clearly, a content analysis of Western editorial media coverage is utilized displaying the discursive forces at play. So this chapter essentially endeavors to show that the way we talk about Iran, and especially about this idea of the compatibility of Islam and democracy, is an important intersection of ideas between West and non-West. So the next chapter looks at Iran's resistance to Western sanctions regimes during Ahmadinejad's presidency. I actually have another article coming out, hopefully soon, which looks at how the state in this period used a post-colonial identity to sort of protect its national interests in this regard, but I digress. The efficiency of sanctions is something that's actually quite hotly debated, even in mainstream IR. And Iran has been a target of sanctions for decades. This specific case looks at how a continuation of sanctions as a tentpole of Western policy not only empowered anti-Western political forces in Iran, but were largely ineffective at eliciting the desired change. Just mindful of the time here, so I'm going to move on. Finally, the Iran nuclear deal and the consequences of rhetorical change in diplomacy. The nuclear deal, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, so we call it the nuclear deal, marks a meaningful change in Western engagement with Iran, one that recognizes its positional perspective, disposes of reductive rhetoric, and is focused on actual diplomatic outcomes, actual outcomes that benefit everybody, or at least benefit the parties. Though many factors played a role in manifesting the conditions for this agreement, concerns of justice are actually at the center of this analysis. The JCPOA was short-lived, but it resulted in a bespoke diplomatic agreement that both assuaged Iranian concerns of pariahism and Western concerns of nuclear armament. And it was working for a long time. In fact, until it ended. So, not to spoil anything, but I did come to a few conclusions. Iran's history is reflected quite vividly in its foreign policy. It kind of sounds like common sense, but it is something that's often overlooked. Iranian IR scholarship reflects a growing desire for more scholarly consideration of these non-Western sources. Non-Western perspectives can be a tool at the disposal of all scholars, not just native ones. So anybody can draw on these sources. Anybody can use them. Anybody can draw on their wisdom. And then finally, an awareness of discursive ideology in communication assists in drawing out marginalized perspectives, even if barriers to access exist. So basically, an awareness of the way that power in communication works is very helpful as a method of analysis there. So these will probably come up in the question, so I won't spend too much time on this, but there are a lot of implications for today. for this kind of analysis. So understanding pro-democracy and women's movements in Iran, we can use this lens to better understand that. The changing regional context post-Gaza, changing moral position of Iran, or at least the way that it views itself as a leader of Muslims or the Ummah, despite the fact that they're a minority sect. They often say that Iran is a leader of Muslims. How much does the Gaza conflict contribute to that? Its relations with Arab neighbors, but not just Arab neighbors, China, Russia, the United States. As we can see in the picture there, China actually brokered a ceasefire for a while that the West could never do between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Yemen. Shifting factional powers inside Iran, so from clerics to the IRGC, and what happens with a nuclear Iran? What does the world do? And then finally, as Khomeini is getting quite long in the tooth, quite old, does the Wilayat al-Faqih, meaning the Islamic jurisconsult, die with Khomeini? Is he the last one? Who's his successor? It's something that nobody in Iran really wants to talk about, or at least no one in the Islamic Republic wants to talk about. And what replaces it? Do we have, does the IRGC kind of take over? What does that mean? And these are all questions that all of us have, but looking at it through this different lens can help us find different insights. So again, thank you all so much for humoring me, for listening, and thanks for coming. As I say, this has been a labor of love and about 10 years of my life. But it means a lot that you're here, and thank you so much for coming. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrew. You're not off the hook just yet. Thanks for the really illuminating presentation. Now we have an opportunity to raise some questions, pose alternative ideas, or tease out some of those points that Andrew's made in his presentation. Stephen, go ahead.
Thank you, Andrew. This is a topic outside of my immediate expertise, but I've got a question about in your findings, where you're studying this as non-Western types of bias theory, whether there's anything in your findings that actually discredit, like, or disprove, I mean, stronger about it.
Yeah.
Things like realism. Does Iranian foreign policy operate in a way that contradicts realist thinking, something like that? Could you examine that, or would you agree with it?
So I did examine that. So for those, I'm not sure if everybody can hear Stephen, but Stephen's basically asking if I found anything in my findings that sort of disproves mainstream thinking, particularly realist thinking. And the answer, like I kind of alluded to in the beginning, is yes and no. It's not such a clear cut, answer. Unfortunately, IR theory, or its utility for me, is, this is how I speak about it to my students at least. It's kind of like a tool belt. You've got all these different lenses on your belt, and if you're looking at the Cold War, you take your realism telescope out and you look at it, and everything makes sense. You take your realism scope and look at a civil conflict or a gender-based conflict in the Sahel, and you can't see anything. It's blurry. It makes no sense. So it doesn't necessarily mean that. Sorry, I'm getting an echo here.
So I can see the question.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Sharam. So there wasn't anything that was exactly contradictory in there. We don't see Iran, for example, get rid of the idea of national interest or stop caring about its survival. The very fact that it is pursuing a nuclear weapon means that those ideas are prevalent. What it does mean, though, is these ideas can exist in parallel. That ideas about national interest, about survival, are obviously true for Iran as well. They live in the same world. They live with the same pressures. They're dealing with states that operate in that way, so they have to respond in kind. But there are clearly other motivations that make a lot of sense. For example, realists believe that really the type of government, the type of, or the identity of the makeup of this government really is incidental to its actions. Well, Iran, in the sanctions chapter in particular, I showed how Iran moved heaven and earth to resist sanctions to the point where, if anybody has been to Iran in the last 10 years, the smog in Tehran, unbearable. They institutionalize this resistance to the point where the purpose of sanctions is to change the cost-benefit analysis. This policy is no longer worth it because of the sheer economic damage that sanctions are doing. But Iran resisted sanctions for decades, decades and decades and decades, sometimes to a lot to the detriment of its own people. But it had the purpose of changing the norms around nuclear proliferation, of saying, we don't accept the non-proliferation treaty because it says that these states are allowed nuclear weapons, but Iran is not. And that they often, the state uses this term nuclear apartheid, which is a bit on the nose, but it basically says that there are two kinds of states that can be trusted with nuclear weapons according to the West, and states that can't be trusted with nuclear weapons according to the West. What came out of that? The JCPOA, which was a direct bilateral, multilateral agreement that was bespoke for Iran's needs. And if you read that document, which I go through in the book, the shift in language is very different. Talk to Iran much like a peer rather than a recalcitrant pariah. So yeah, to say that realism isn't relevant to Iran would be pretty silly. But undoubtedly, a different lens of looking at Iran shows potentially outcomes that were, or at least factors that we hadn't really considered before if we look at just a realist analysis.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks,
Yes,
Stephen.
question back there.
Ali.
First, I would like to thank you. As an Iranian, I'm grateful that a Western person, scholar like you, is looking at the problems associated with Iran
Well, thank you.
from a Western perspective. My question is that in your book, how do you define national interest? Because from like Iranian public perspective, whatever Iran does, the regime does, is against the interest of its people, no matter in national policy, foreign policy, for example, in the comprehensive, they jeopardize our borders. So how national interest is.
Oh, that's a good question. So a lot of the mainstream definition of national interest is kind of, not in so many words, whatever the state deems it to be, right? And for the Iranian people, that's, as you say, that's a big problem, because often the needs of the state are very different to the needs of the Iranian people. And in fact, that's becoming increasingly so in Iran. Defining a quote-unquote non-Western idea of national interest is actually quite difficult. And it gets back to that idea of the fact that these perspectives are quite scattered and they're all quite different. So if you look at, for example, a post-colonial approach from Africa, from a post-colonial context in Africa, they're going to see the interests of the people and the state or of the nation as very different from for example, an Iranian national interest. But I think it's quite clear that as much as we need to be quite cynical of the Iranian state's use of things like Islam, that identity is a key part in that. What's interesting as well is that realist analysis quite often discounts identity in the West. And Western identity is actually quite formative in realist analysis as well. It's sort of, realists quite often say, well, we don't, I mean, it's in the name. We don't talk about how the world should be, we talk about the way the world is. And as a result, it becomes this scientific application, this scientific approach, which is, again, like I say, very useful in certain contexts, but it does remove a lot of this stuff. It does remove the opportunity to say, well, if Iran's incorporated a resistance to Western power into its national interests, every day the Friday prayers of death to America, if that's not just a performance, if that's actually about building a national identity to resist the West, then that makes the resistance to sanctions policy, the resistance to Western support of Israel, to activity in the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, it makes all of that make actually a lot more sense, as opposed to sort of saying, well, Iran's an authoritarian state, it's quite opaque. In some ways, maybe it's not. And again, I should say a lot of realists kind of dismiss a lot of this, a lot of the religious rhetoric as purely domestic. So there are obviously other perspectives out there. But given this study, given what I believe, I think it plays much more of a role than we probably give it credit for. Thanks, Molly.
Okay.
Yes.
You started with Westphalia and nation state.
Yes.
So my question is, have you considered to look at the question from a civilization state? It's Russian, Indian, and Chinese.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, and you come across. I mean, in one of my cases, Muhammad Khatami talks about Iran from this civilizational perspective. Talks about Islam as a civilization. In core Western, post 9/11 scholarship, pre and post 9/11 scholarship, Samuel Huntington also talks about civilization as well, and talking about this clash of civilizations, which. Again, we run into the same problems as national interest, because a lot of what Muhammad Khatami does is, he's actually written a book on it, is try and define what civilization is, and really, really struggles. And a lot, particularly LHM Ling and Amitav Arkaya, really critique this idea of a focus on Westphalian style sovereignty, and the fact that, that is a distinctly not only Western invention, but one that curtails our understanding of the way that international world politics actually works. Not all issues are confined to borders. Not all issues are confined to sovereign dominance and power in those terms. We need to understand much broader terms. And civilization kind of does that to a point, but it also has this homogenizing aspect to it as well, where we sort of see, okay, is Islam a civilization? Okay, well, is Islamic civilization, is it Sunni civilization because that's the majority? Russian civilization or Slavic civilization, does that represent the interests of Russia, or does it represent the interests of the Russian people? It's just as murky. It's just as problematic. But what it does do is acknowledge the sort of Western-centric nature of the Westphalian state. And a lot of these scholars who I refer to as in the book as part of this non-Western international relations discourse movement, or NWERD movement, really do go that far and critique the Westphalian state as this Western monolith as well. But yeah, then you're starting to tear all of it apart and starting from scratch again, which is another task, a different task to what I'm doing. But yes, good point.
Janice, please.
Janice. Thanks.
Say that Iranian IR scholarship reflects a growing desire for non-Western perspectives.
Yep.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. We need non-Western sources, but we need non-Western frameworks. Because I would say that our Western lineup frameworks are reasonably popular with brain experts and
Yes.
And I mean, political scholars like
yeah.
so on. But I'm interested in where you identify those points.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right in that a lot of scholarship really does look towards mainstream IR as a quite effective lens, but really, and you're right to make the different you're right to clear the difference between non-Western perspectives from non-Western scholars and people drawing and the advocacy, the separate advocacy for drawing on non-Western perspectives, if that makes sense. And the answer is that there is actually quite a lot. Especially, there's actually quite a lot of scholarship that is, in particular, quite critical of the Islamic Republic that holds that view, which is in some ways quite surprising because these narratives can be used quite effectively as kind of state, shall we say, regime supporting perspectives. Like I said, the post-colonial perspective is quite effective, or has been used over and over again by the Islamic Republic to justify resistance to sanctions, especially the recent sanctions. But particularly in sort of Iranian historical analysis as well, I see it quite a lot. There's a name's escaping me now. Did have it prepared, but it's a fantastic historical book that looks at sort of not just how Iranian history is viewed today in kind of popular discourse, but how it's used by the regime to sort of create a mythology around itself. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that's manifested throughout Iranian history, not just in the Islamic Republic, but also obviously in Mohammad Reza's rule. So it comes from quite a few different places, but again, it's important to note that it's not monolithic, that you're right, that a lot of Iranian scholars, and especially a lot of the ones that expats from the Beltway in DC, there are quite a lot of Iranian expats who make great work, who are like security studies experts, who are like nuclear proliferation experts and policy experts, do tend to steer clear of non-Western sources, and there's good reasons for that. There's not a rule book. There's not a clear kind of pamphlet that you can go to, like these other IR theories that can say, how do I explain this? And that's the benefit, supposed to be the benefit of theory. It's supposed to explain events. And the downside of non-Western perspectives is that they don't really have that. There's not really a method of analysis. All we can really do is sort of be a little bit open-minded about drawing on them. And that sounds simple, but it is effective.
Now, we're not going to have time to go to our online participants for questions, but as chair prerogative, I'd like to ask a final question. If you don't mind.
Yes, please, Sharon.
You started your presentation by sharing the congressional report on Iran, where the highlighted section was Iran's an ideological state based on its revolutionary ideas.
Yeah.
And that comes through a lot of literature.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of also using that in some of my publications. So the implication of emphasizing ideology is that Iran is an exceptional state, is an irrational state, right? So how does your critique make sense of Iran to that claim that Iran is an irrational state, is an exceptional state, and your normal rules of engagement don't quite apply to Iran?
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Well, on the one hand, it's also a critique of, it's not, again, the book doesn't just critique sort of realist positions. It also critiques liberal positions and sort of saying that there is a correct and incorrect ideological framing for a state. And I think that's a great question because it really gets to kind of the heart of that element of difference in sort of the way in which ideology is viewed at the state level or at the foreign policy level. Realists quite often think that ideology, I mean, if you listen to people like John Miyashima, especially now, he'll say things like idealism and ideology is dangerous in foreign policy, very dangerous. Doesn't matter what the ideology is, it can be for good reasons, but it is dangerous. And the implication of, if you're looking at the realist lens of saying that Iran is ideological, is yes, Iran is dangerous. Now, what that does is it's not necessarily untrue, right? That's not necessarily untrue, but what it does is it frames the discussion about Iran, as a pariah, as a state that doesn't have a rational outlook on the world. I mean, as much as Russia, for example, is a danger to the international order, we don't refer to Russia as an ideological state. We often refer to Russia as a quote unquote realist state that is being backed into a corner and is responding to these kind of forces. We don't refer to Iran in the same way. And as much as I partially agree with the idea that we should be challenging these perspectives, if we're using those frames of reference, well, doesn't that in some ways sort of discredit the idea that all state motivations are the same, that we, even in realist analysis, we do view the motivations of states as different, and that when we talk or when we discuss policy on these states, when we formulate policy on these states, that they're different for a reason. But yes, it's also important to note that it's hard not to call Iran an ideological state. It is based on an ideology, communism. And as much as we need to acknowledge that fact, we also need to acknowledge that the more we see ideology as kind of pejorative, I would say, in itself. Having an ideology from a realist perspective is a pejorative. Again, ask John Mearsheimer. So that's kind of the context that I think is not necessarily problematic, but gives us cause to look at non-Western perspectives. It's not that calling Iran an ideology say is wrong at all, because it's not. But it's the context in which we deal with it that presents missed opportunities for diplomacy, presents missed opportunities for détente, and stops us working on things like the JCPOA. Oh, they're an ideological state. They won't understand what they're saying. We're talking different languages. That's not true. The JCPOA worked until Trump tore it up. So I hope that answers the question. It's a long-winded way of saying it, but that it's the framing that the way we talk about ideology in Mayar that I kind of have a problem with sometimes.
Well, thanks so much, Andrew. We could stand here and talk some more for more hours on Iran foreign policy, but I think you're exhausted now, and lunch is here. I can smell it. So congratulations on the book. Amazing achievement. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you.